Привет! So, is Ukraine and a Ukrainian victory actually preventing the outbreak of World War III? We've seen many reactions in the US, most notably Joe Rogan apparently going off on a tirade on his podcast, basically accusing Ukrainians of trying to start World War III because they resist Russian aggression. And it's now almost 3 years, over 1,000 days since the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. But in fact, the Russo-Ukrainian war started back in 2014. So you could say that Ukraine is resisting for over 10 years. Now, there's been a response from the preeminent academician in the US with respect to Ukraine, Timothy Snyder. So I'm going to read out what Timothy Snyder has said in response to Joe Rogan, just the 3 points and 3 arguments he makes that say the opposite. In fact, a Ukrainian victory is what will prevent World War III. He says, great power conflict in Europe. Ukrainians have contained the war to their own country at staggering costs. Without ongoing support from allies, Ukraine could lose, allowing the war to spread into Europe. Now, with that first point, I would point out that, well, Ukraine is Europe, and Ukraine actually has invaded and currently occupies a small part of Russia, de jure Russia, so in the Kursk Oblast. But by and large, his point is valid. What would happen if Ukraine were to lose? What would Russia do with all the soldiers that they have left over? What would they do with the resources that they have that potentially could take from Ukraine? Well, the most likely thing is that when all you have is a big hammer, you're going to look for nails, right? That's a saying that we have in English. And where would Russia move its troops? Would they be happy with absorbing Ukraine? Well, the best indication we have is before the 2022 invasion, Russia sent a draft agreement to NATO, to its Western adversaries. And in that, it demanded that NATO go back to its pre-1997 borders. That means that, well, Germany or United Germany would be in NATO, but not Czechoslovakia, the 3 Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, and the whole slew of countries that have joined since, like Romania, Bulgaria, etc. So what would that mean? That would mean that they would almost certainly put pressure at a very minimum on countries that are part of NATO to be left unprotected. And one way of doing that would be to move troops to the borders of, say, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, maybe Finland, although the Finns probably have a stronger military and bigger population, so maybe they'd be less inclined to mess with Finland. They could move it to countries that are not in NATO, maybe intimidate Georgia if there's a new Georgian government. For example, the current Georgian government is pretty favorable to Moscow. They may move it towards Kazakhstan, although China and Kazakhstan also have good relations. That would be maybe problematic for Russia if they were to threaten Kazakhstan in that sense. So they could move it somewhere else. They may move it to the border of Mongolia, who knows, and threaten them. They would probably move those troops somewhere else and try to expand their influence and potentially invade another country. So if Ukraine had fallen, like most people expect, in 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months, whatever, it would have been very quickly at the beginning of 2022, then Russia presumably would have moved its army somewhere else and threatened somewhere else with it. So definitely Ukraine's resistance has contained the conflict. Pretty much it is basically just contained within Ukraine, with a few rockets having gone, actually landed in Romania and in Poland. And we can say that Ukraine also advanced into a small part of Russia. But considering how much of Europe could be involved in the conflict, then Ukrainian resistance has definitely limited that, that's for sure. So the second one he says is outbreak of conflict in the Pacific. So Ukraine's resistance deters Chinese aggression in Taiwan. A strong Western coalition supporting Ukraine signals to China that risky offensives would fail, reducing the chance of escalation in Asia. I'm not an expert in Sino-American relations or Asia, so my reaction, my very superficial reaction, without having studied too much of it, is that basically China considers Taiwan to be part of China, and they do not exclude retaking Taiwan or uniting with Taiwan by military force. It's predominantly an island, one big island, so I presume that would be quite complicated. But if you look at what has been happening with Ukraine, if, for example, Russia were to prevail in the medium to long term and the West were not to support Ukraine, basically just disengage and leave Ukraine alone, and eventually Russia was to take control, what would that signal to China? It would signal that, well, they could attempt to invade Taiwan, and even if they weren't successful immediately, then could they count on a repeat of the West withdrawing its support from Taiwan in the medium to long term? Also, if you look at Afghanistan, the way the US left wasn't great. It's a bit of a complete fiasco at the end of the day after 20 years. So this would give an impression that China could go and take Taiwan. Probably more likely. I'm obviously, with my background in international relations, I specialized in the region affecting the russo-ukrainian war, so Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, Central Asia, and I speak those languages as well, Ukrainian, Russian, etc., Belarusian. So Asia, not my forte, but seems plausible to me. Let me know what you think down in the comments if you happen to be an Asia expert. And thirdly, it says nuclear proliferation. Ukraine's continued resistance to one of the world's nuclear powers prevents a global rush for nuclear weapons. If Ukraine were to fall, non-nuclear countries would seek nuclear arms for self-defense, making the world far more volatile. That is almost a certainty. I would say even now, because of the Budapest Memorandum, which was from 1994, where Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons. And in exchange, well, Russia, US, UK signed a document saying that they respected, amongst other things, the sovereignty and the borders of Ukraine. Actually, also Kazakhstan and Belarus also signed the agreement. Now, Russia obviously ignores that Budapest Memorandum. There was a security assurance, not a security guarantee. It's a little bit legalese, so it was not a very strong commitment. But anyways, under international law, the borders of Ukraine were recognized not just by Russia at the time in the 1990s when Ukraine became independent again in 1991, but also by Vladimir Putin afterwards. He signed several documents, made several statements saying he respected that Crimea was part of Ukraine, and obviously the Donbass was part of Ukraine, and the other parts that they've invaded since. So security assurances certainly don't help, and Ukraine did give up its nuclear arsenal at the time in the 1990s, which was significant, as well as destroying other military equipment. Now, in hindsight, that looks like a mistake because nuclear weapons are supposed to act as a deterrence to a country invading you. However, you see in this war there are exceptions. Russia also has been invaded, even if just a small bit, in the Kursk Oblast by a non-nuclear power, and they didn't use nuclear weapons. Ukraine's invasion is actually illegal under international law because they were being illegally invaded by Russia since 2014. So would other countries, number one, believe in security guarantees or security assurances? Certainly not. And no country would probably be willing to give up its nuclear weapons if they already have them. However, proliferation, most of the countries that will be insecure about Russia potentially invading them next are part of NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and there are 3 nuclear powers that are part of that. So you get the United States, United Kingdom, and France. So they already have a nuclear umbrella. However, if the West abandons Ukraine, could, say, Poland, could the 3 Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, really rely on the US, the UK, or France to protect them with conventional weapons in the future, or use nuclear weapons to protect them if needs be? That will be under question. And then what would be the solution? Well, if nuclear weapons are actually an effective deterrent to being invaded, then it would make sense for countries like Poland, for example, and maybe, well, I would say it makes sense for them to try and get a nuclear weapon, leave the nuclear weapon non-proliferation treaty. Belarus has actually left that, and Russia claims it's actually stationing nuclear weapons on Belarusian soil at the moment. Belarus doesn't control them. So perhaps that nuclear weapons would be moved under the control of another country like the United Kingdom, France, or United States onto Polish territory, into the Baltics, or they would seek to get their own weapons so that they would feel like we have a nuclear deterrent. So if Ukraine fails, definitely there would be a bigger incentive for countries definitely not to give up any nuclear weapons that they have, any nuclear deterrent. And countries that, and I've spoken about countries that are already part of NATO that, they in theory can rely on nuclear deterrent from those three states, France, United Kingdom, and US, and also conventional deterrence. However, countries like, I'm just thinking Moldova, Kazakhstan also gave up its nuclear weapons. Would they feel threatened that maybe they need to reacquire them? Definitely there would be big incentives for that. So we could see more nuclear proliferation, and obviously that means that the more countries having nukes, would that make the world safer or more dangerous? Well, there's some theories that if every country had nuclear weapons, then we'd have no war because no one would be able to invade. However, we see that Russia still ended up in a situation where they have nuclear weapons, but some of their de jure territory is actually occupied. So it's not really so sure to me that the world would be safer. Russia rattles its nuclear saber quite frequently during this war. I don't personally think that there's a very high likelihood that they're going to use nuclear weapons. However, there's always that risk to be lots of other countries who may have conflicts with their neighbors or disputes having nuclear weapons. Probably not. That's the general consensus. So Timothy Snyder, by and large, I agree with him. I agree that overall Ukraine winning would be a good thing because it would show also that trying to change international borders by force would have backfired if Russia has to leave. At a minimum, go back to where they were in 2022, if not all the way back pre-2014, actually respect Ukraine's de jure legally recognized borders. That would show that trying to change them by force ultimately doesn't work, and it's hugely expensive. Russian economy, I have the video from yesterday where their currency dropped dramatically, and it looks like, well, we'll have to see. Obviously, in the next few weeks, it could drop further. It looks like they have severe economic problems looming, very high inflation, cost of living crisis there is enormous. It was in the Russian press yesterday that potatoes have gone up 75% in the last year. So definitely they have a lot of issues. It's very expensive. Obviously, the number of people who've died, just the human cost is enormous. Plus, you have the amount of damage that a war does. It's probably somewhere north of $1 trillion in terms of damage that's done to Ukraine, and a small bit of that also has been done in Russia because Ukraine is firing back with drones for a long time into Russia. Now they are using ATACMS, Storm Shadow, and French Scalp missiles, medium-range rockets, firing them at military targets. So Russia is using 40% of its budget towards the war. Internal security at the moment is considered about 7 or 8% of GDP. So it's expensive, and if it doesn't work, then that itself will deter other countries from trying to do the same and starting major conflicts. That would be my argument. But you see Timothy Snyder. Let me know what you think about his arguments down below in the description. And it is interesting. I'll probably make another video about the reaction and how people like, as I mentioned at the start, Joe Rogan, how they just seem to be have this instinctive reaction against nuclear war is coming, and it's all the Ukrainians' fault because they are resisting, but not Vladimir Putin and Russia's fault because they're threatening to use nuclear weapons. It seems counterintuitive to me. Let me know what you think down below in the description as well. And I will leave this video at that. Do побачення, and as you see in the t-shirt, Slava Ukraini.